Hello and welcome to my beginner's tanking guide for the Protection Paladin in World of Warcraft Battle for Azeroth. If you're coming to this video from one of the other videos in the series, you can check the timestamps below to skip the introduction and get right to the new content. In this video series, we're going to be covering a variety of topics designed to help brand new Paladin tanks, or those of you who have been tanking for a little while, but maybe still feel like there's something that you're missing. All sorts of goodies are going to be in the description box below. You'll find timestamps, links to all the other videos in this series, a link to the playlist that contains these videos, as well as any other supplemental information that I think is going to help you as you learn how to tank on the Protection Paladin. The pinned comment on this video is going to contain any updates or corrections that I have to the guide so that it can stay current for as long as possible. Alright, so we're ready to start talking about talents on the Protection Paladin. The goal for this video is to create what I call a passive talent build, where we go through and we choose talents from the tree that are not going to add additional buttons and complexity for us, but are going to keep things fairly minimal, add some passive boosts to our different abilities, and allow us to really just practice the core rotation that we learned as we're running a dungeon. We're not going to take just outwardly bad talents, but we are going to take some talents that aren't necessarily considered the best in the tier simply because we want to keep that complexity down. So this is going to allow us to go into dungeons, practice our rotation, and once we're ready, we can go ahead and upgrade our talent build to something a little bit better. And generally, a better talent build is going to add some additional buttons for you to press, some additional complexity to your rotation, or some alternative utility options for you to use. So we're going to go through and look at this passive talent build, but we're also going to look at all the other talents we don't choose. And at the end of the video and in the description box below, I'm going to include a couple of other alternative talent builds that you can use once you feel comfortable with the rotation and ready to step things up to the next level. So this is what our passive talent build is going to look like. We're going to go through each tier and we're going to talk about each option on the tier, why we selected the one that we have, what other ones are potentially good, and then once we're done going through and talking about all the talents, we're going to come back around, look at our passive build all together and see how that may or may not affect the way that we play. On the 15 talent tier, our go-to talent is going to be Holy Shield. This says your block chance is increased by 15%, you are able to block spells, and your successful blocks deal 491 holy damage to your attacker. So the reflecting damage here is a nice little bonus, but we're mainly picking this up for the increased chance to block. 15% is fairly significant, and the ability to block spells. Now, instead of just being able to block people who are wailing on us in melee range, we could block some of those fireballs and caster damage as well. So overall, this is just a really good passive ability. It doesn't add any complexity. It lets us do what we want to do even better. On this talent tier, we also have Redoubt. This says Avenger's Shield bounces to one additional target and increases your block by 75% for 8 seconds. So this will let your Avenger's Shield hit 4 targets instead of 3, which is good as long as you have more than 3 targets. So it's good on initial pulls for the dungeons where maybe you have 4 or 5 enemies that you're trying to pick up. But once you get down to 3 enemies or you're fighting just a boss, this extra bounce doesn't really do anything for you. And it's notable here that this doesn't increase your chance to block, it increases the amount that you block by 75%, and you're probably not going to have a super high block chance here. So having this increased 75% chance to block is okay, but it's not awesome compared to just having an increase in 15% chance to block, because you would rather block smaller attacks more often than occasionally block one attack for a large percentage of damage. Because in the long run, you're just going to, blocking more attacks is going to mitigate more damage overall. So Redoubt is an okay talent, but I think it's really outshined by Holy Shield. And so even in more advanced builds, I think you'd probably go with Holy Shield. The other talent on this tier is Blessed Hammer. This is an ability that will replace your Hammer of the Righteous. Hammer of the Righteous is our little filler ability that we have. This says throws a blessed hammer that spirals outward, dealing 499 holy damage to enemies and weakening them, reducing the damage you take from their next auto attack by 12%. This is an instant ability, 4.3-second recharge. That may be a little different for you. And it comes with 3 charges instead of the 2 that Hammer of the Righteous has. Now, this ability, I think, generally is still going to be outshined by Holy Shield. However, I do like to use Blessed Hammer in open world content because those hammers that spiral can hit enemies multiple times. Also, I feel like if you're playing lower difficulty content that is kind of below your gear score, if you're helping out a friend or something like that, then you could easily use Blessed Hammer in place of Holy Shield, where you want to output a little more damage as opposed to being too worried about your own survivability. So overall on this tier, I really do think Holy Shield is the go-to talent. Redoubt is okay, but generally outshined by the other talents on this tier. And Blessed Hammer is good if you're in open world content or you're playing content that is not actively challenging for you, or in situations where you just don't think you're going to be worried about your own defense. On the 30 tier, our go-to talent is going to be Crusader's Judgment. Judgment now has 2 charges, and Grand Crusader now also grants a charge of Judgment. So Judgment is our core rotational ability. It does a nice chunk of damage and reduces the cooldown on our Shield of the Righteous charges. Having 2 charges of Judgments means that we can work it into the rotation even more often, and we can reduce the cooldown on Shield of the Righteous even further. We have the added bonus that our Grand Crusader will now give us a charge of Judgment as well as reducing the remaining cooldown on our Avenger's Shield when it procs. So overall, this is just going to mean a lot more Judgment, which is a nice chunky piece of damage that we can do to our target, but also it's going to mean more reduction in the cooldown of Shield of Righteous, so we can have that buff up more often. Also in this tier, we have the first Avenger. Avenger's Shield now deals 50% increased damage to the first target hit, and Grand Crusader now has an additional 10% chance to occur. So if you want to go full Captain America shield throwing, this is the talent to do that. You're going to deal a nice chunk of damage for every Avenger's Shield thrown to your primary target, and you're going to have an increased chance to do so. So this is going to bump the chance for Grand Crusader to proc up from 15% to 25%, which is pretty frequent. This is another valid talent choice depending on what your goals are. In this case, this is a great AoE ability to use, and being able to chunk that out even more often with that 10% increase, and then when you do, dealing additional damage to that first target, makes this a pretty solid ability. I think this is another ability that you can choose if you're in open world content, or if you're in a situation where you're less concerned about defense and more concerned about your offense. The final talent on this tier is going to be Bastion of Light. This is a instant cast ability with a 2-minute cooldown that immediately grants you 3 charges of Shield of the Righteous. Typically, this is going to be outshined by the other 2 talents on this tier, but this is good in a situation where you want to constantly maintain Shield of the Righteous. That's going to be typically a specific boss in a specific raid or a specific dungeon, and you're probably not going to want to use this talent in other situations, but there are going to be times where having a constant Shield of the Righteous buff up will be useful, and that is where you would use this talent. But generally speaking, you're going to want to use Crusader's Judgment as the more defensive option on this talent tier, First Avenger as the more AoE offensive option. Moving on to the 45 tier, this one is kind of up to you. We're going to go with Fist of Justice. This causes your Judgment to reduce the remaining cooldown on Hammer of Justice by 6 seconds. Hammer of Justice is our nice stun. It's going to stun the target for 6 seconds and typically has a 1-minute cooldown. But with Fist of Justice, every time we cast Judgment, we're going to reduce that cooldown by 6 seconds. We're going to be casting Judgment more often because we have Crusader's Judgment, so we're going to reduce that stun cooldown pretty frequently. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that stuns do have a diminishing return on a specific target, so if you're stunning the same target over and over, or the other people in your party or raid are stunning the same target over and over, then each cast of this is going to be worth less and less. However, if you're in a dungeon where you're typically able to throw out a Fist of Justice once or twice per pool, then you're in a pretty good situation because you're probably not going to be stunning the same enemy, and in that case, you should get the full value of the stun, but that is something to keep in mind. And like I said, this talent tier is really just down to choice, so I do think that this next talent, Repentance, is probably the least useful out of all three of these in just general circumstances. This is going to cost you 1200 mana, has a 30-yard range, 1.6-second cast, 15-second cooldown. It forces an enemy target to meditate, incapacitating them for 1 minute. So this is just going to completely shut them down for 1 minute. However, damage taken is going to break the effect, and it's only usable against humanoids, demons, undead, dragonkin, and giants. So you can stun anything with Fist of Justice. You can't necessarily do the same thing with Repentance, and on top of that, Repentance will be broken by damage. So this is probably the least useful in this talent tier, in my opinion. But you do have another pretty valid option with Blinding Light. This costs 1200 mana, is instant cast with a 1.5 minute cooldown, so pretty hefty cooldown here. But it emits dazzling light in all directions, blinding enemies within 10 yards, causing them to wander disoriented for 6 seconds. Non-holy damage will break the disorient effect. So this is good because it doesn't suffer from diminishing returns like a stun would. However, any non-holy damage will break the effect of this ability. So mainly this is really good to use to interrupt cast abilities. And potentially just kind of cause a distraction for your party, because in all likelihood, whatever enemies you're fighting are going to take non-holy damage pretty quickly after you cast this. So this is less of a lock everything down for 6 seconds ability and more of a interrupt and disorient targets for 1, 2, 3 seconds sort of ability. It's still completely valid if you want another button on your bar to be able to push to go along with your Hammer of Justice. In most cases, if I had First Avenger, I would probably go with Blinding Light. If I have Crusader's Judgment, then Fist of Justice makes a pretty good amount of sense. But in either case, I would recommend Fist of Justice or Blinding Light, depending on what your goals are. Repentance is another one of those kind of talents where it's a specific use case. So if you're in a dungeon or a raid where there are lots of humanoids, demons, undead, dragon, and giants, and you want to lock them down, and maybe your particular party composition doesn't have a lot of ways to do that, then you could pick up Repentance if you need to. On the 60 tier, our go-to talent is going to be Cavalier. This gives our Divine Steed 2 charges. Divine Steed is our movement ability that allows us to jump on top of our charger for 3 seconds, increase our movement speed. We can use this in combat. We can use this while we're indoors. This is essentially the button that allows us to run out of the big nasty AoEs quickly. It also allows us to get from room to room or a group of enemies to another group of enemies really quickly. It's just great utility and one of the only ways we have to really give ourselves a movement speed buff as a Protection Paladin. So this is the go-to talent for me on this tier. We do have the Retribution Aura. This says you and your allies within 60 yards are protected by an aura that lashes out against any melee attackers, dealing 60 holy damage. Now, unlike the other talents we previously talked about, this one is kind of the worst talent on this tier, and there are almost no situations where you're going to want to take this over Cavalier or our other option on this tier. 60 damage is basically nothing, and you're not getting any sort of defensive or protection bonus here, so that doesn't really help you either. Our other option is Blessing of Spell Warding, and this gives us an alternative to our Blessing of Protection. Now, Blessing of Protection is one of our big defensive cooldowns. Instant, 5 minute, it grants complete immunity to physical damage for 10 seconds. Blessing of Spell Warding does the same thing, but for magical damage instead of physical damage. So if you're in a dungeon, raid situation where there's a lot of incoming magical damage, and you think you could really benefit from this as opposed to Blessing Protection, then you could definitely pick this up. I think for general uses, if you're just out there, queuing up for random dungeons, Cavalier is going to be the better option for you, give you that extra utility. Also, if you're in open world content, it's good for that as well. But if you are doing targeted dungeons or raids, or maybe there's an affix, this is going to cause a ton of magical damage to come in, then Blessing of Spell Warding is going to be a good option for that. Moving on to the 75 tier, we're going to be picking up Unbreakable Spirit. This reduces the cooldown of your Divine Shield, Ardent Defender, and Lay on Hands by 30%. So our Divine Shield is our big immunity from everything ability, so we get a reduced cooldown on that. We have Lay on Hands, which is our big bad 100% self-heal and probably 100% full heal for anyone else in your party ability. We get a reduction on that, and we get a reduction on our Ardent Defender, which is an ability that we can use much more often than the other two, so being able to use it even more often than that is great. This is the one that gives us a 20% damage reduction and causes any attack that would kill us to instead bring us to 20% of our maximum health. So basically with this talent, we're picking this up so that your oh crap buttons can be used more often and you can get used to using them more often. If you're learning how to tank, you're going to run into more situations where you're going to need these abilities as opposed to when you're a little bit more comfortable and maybe you're okay with stepping away from this talent. But because we have these abilities, I want you to be able to learn and practice them, and so reducing the cooldowns lets you hit those buttons more often and figure out what happens and what's the best strategy to use when you do hit one of these buttons. On this tier, we also have Final Stand. This says when you use Divine Shield, you also taunt all targets within 15 yards for 8 seconds. This is a good ability to use in higher difficulty content because when you use Divine Shield, normally the enemies that are attacking you will look at the next target down on the threat table and start attacking them and totally ignore you. Instead, this allows you to hit Divine Shield, have immunity to all damage, and continue to tank those targets for 8 seconds, which is pretty huge, and it can kind of trivialize some encounters and also turns your Divine Shield into a really, really good oh crap button because you're immune to everything, everything's still attacking you, and your party can work on trying to recuperate from whatever situation you were in. The last talent on this tier is Hand of the Protector. This is going to replace Light of the Protector, which is our healing ability. This is the one that does a decent heal, but then does a even better heal depending on how much health we are missing. So with Hand of the Protector, we're getting a slight cooldown reduction, 14 seconds as opposed to 16 seconds. But more importantly, this is going to call down Light to heal a friendly target. Now, our Light of the Protector is only a self-cast ability. We can only use it on ourselves. Hand of the Protector is usable on friendly targets. So this allows us to heal other party members for a pretty good chunk of health. So if you're in a situation where you feel like you need some additional healing, maybe you're playing with a new healer and you just want to be able to support them because you're not too worried about your damage, maybe you're a little outgeared for the content, or something along those lines, you can use Hand of the Protector. Also, if you're just out with a friend doing open world content, Hand of the Protector is a nice choice as well, so you can top them off, especially if you are playing with the classes that have a lot of their own self-healing. So this is another good talent on this tier. Generally speaking, though, you're going to want to go with Unbreakable Spirit, just because being able to use your oh crap buttons more often is really, really valuable in almost all cases. There are going to be special circumstances where you want to use Final Stand, and as I mentioned, there are some cases where Hand of the Protector does make sense. Moving on to the 90 talent tier, we're going to start out by taking Consecrated Ground. This says your consecration is 15% larger and enemies within it have 50% reduced movement speed. Now, the reduced movement speed is good if you need to kite enemies around for whatever reason, then this is a good way to do that. You're going to have this large consecration area to work in, but mainly we're picking this up for the 15% increased size on consecration. This is going to give us a bigger area to stand in and work with because remember, we want to be in consecration for various buffs and perks, and we want our enemies to be in consecration so that they take damage. Now, once you feel really comfortable with consecration and feel like you can stay within it and you're used to the rotation and how to work it in, you can step away from this consecrated ground, and with this particular build, pick up Judgment of Light. This says Judgment now causes the next 25 successful attacks against the target to heal the attacker for 242. Now, this is a fairly solid talent. You have to think about a couple of things. first. One, this kind of works well with our build because we already want to be casting Judgment a lot so that we are able to reduce the cooldown of Shield of Righteous and also reduce the cooldown on our Hammer of Justice. We also have the extra charges for Judgment from Crusader's Judgment. And so just overall, we'll be able to cast Judgment a lot. We'll be able to have that 25 successful attacks. The thing to keep in mind is whether or not you're going to get 25 attacks in on a particular target. If you think that your DPS in your party is pretty good and they're not getting the full benefit of this 25 attacks per target, then you may want to just stick with Consecrated Ground and just go for the additional consecration size, pull more enemies in. But if your party is struggling with the healing a little bit or struggling to get enough damage in, or if you just want to have this to throw out on bosses as some constant healing, then this is a really good talent to pick up as well. So I think between these two, it does come down to personal preference and whether you like the convenience of the increased consecration size or need the kiting, possibly in like a mythic dungeon. Or if you want to have the additional healing and you are going to get a lot of use out of these Judgment Alight charges. Also on this tier, we have Aegis of Light. This is a really cool looking ability. It's got a 3-minute cooldown. This channels an Aegis of Light that protects you and all allies standing within 10 yards behind you for 6 seconds, reducing all damage taken by 20%. This isn't a horrible talent, but it is very much a specific use case scenario talent where you need to have a situation that you know is coming up that this is going to be useful in, because generally speaking, for whatever random dungeon you queue into, Consecrated Ground or Judgment of Light is going to be the better pick, but on specific bosses and specific raids, Aegis of Light may be a talent that you want to pick up. Finally, on the 100 tier, we're going to be picking up Last Defender. This says each enemy within 8 yards reduces the damage that you take and increases the damage that you deal by up to 3%. So, what this means is generally in our dungeons, we're going to be tanking 3 to 5 mobs, which means we're going to have 9 to 15% increased damage and reduce damage while we're fighting those enemies. Now, the thing about Last Defender is it scales up and it scales down. As you do the initial pull, you're going to have a lot of increased damage and damage reduction, but as you get further into the pull and enemies start dying, that amount will decrease. Also, if you're just fighting a single target like a boss, then you're only getting 3% increased damage and 3% damage reduction, which is not fantastic, but generally speaking, it's more likely that you're going to get overwhelmed by too many enemies than you are by too few. So as a beginner, I think this is a good talent to pick up. It also is something you don't have to think about. It doesn't add any complexity to your bar. The next talent here is going to be Righteous Protector. This causes your Shield of the Righteous to reduce the remaining cooldown on Light of the Protector and Avenging Wrath by 3 seconds. So, Light of the Protector is our heal, Avenging Wrath is our nice kind of offensive cooldown ability that increases our damage, healing, and critical strike chance by 20%, and also gives us a guaranteed crit on our Light of the Protector. These are both two really good abilities to use in all sorts of circumstances, and having the cooldown reduced by 3 seconds every time we cast Shield of the Righteous, which is something we're going to be doing pretty often, means we're going to be able to use these abilities much more frequently. Now, we're going to be able to use Light of the Protector all the time for that self-heal, which is going to be awesome. And we're going to get some significant cooldown reduction on Avenging Wrath, which means we're going to be able to use it to pump out even more damage. This is a really good ability if you're going to be in scenarios where either the enemies aren't going to live for long enough for you to maintain this buff. So if you have really good DPS in your party or a really good raid group and you get in there and you kill stuff really quickly, then Last Defender really becomes a lot less useful. And Righteous Protector will become more useful because you'll be able to hit that Avenging Wrath and help kill stuff faster, but you'll also be able to use your Light of the Protector to heal yourself much more frequently. This is also a pretty good ability to have when you're in open world content, because then you're probably going to be using your Shield of the Righteous mainly just to deal some damage, and you're going to be chunking those out, and being able to use Light of the Protector more often in open world content is fantastic. And also being able to pop Avenging Wrath on like every single big elite that you see is going to be great as well. Finally, we have Seraphim. This is an instant cast ability with a 45-second cooldown. It says the light temporarily magnifies your power, increasing your haste, critical strike, mastery, and versatility by 1,000. This consumes up to 2 charges of Shield of the Righteous and lasts 8 seconds per charge. So, the big thing to note here is this uses your Shield of the Righteous charges. So if you're in a situation where you don't need the Shield of the Righteous armor increase or the little damage output, this gives you a really nice secondary stat boost, which can equate to some increased defense, but also can equate to increased offense. 16 seconds is a really long time to have a buff up like this. So this does become a better talent to use if you're comfortable enough that you feel like you don't need Last Defender, and if you're in a piece of content where you don't think that you need Righteous Protector. So all the talents on this tier are actually viable in their own way. We're going to stick with Last Defender just because it's simple. It's going to give us some increased survivability and damage output. And then when you're comfortable, you're probably going to end up switching to Righteous Protector. Maybe if you're in content where you're not as concerned about your own personal defense, you'll be able to take Seraphim and use that. So that's an overview of the talents. We're not going to talk about PvP talents because they don't work in instance content, and that's where we're doing most of our tanking at. What we are going to do is take a look at this build real quick and see how it might affect our rotation. So really the only thing here that is going on that's going to cause us to maybe think a little bit is the fact that we have our Crusader's Judgment here, which gives us the extra Judgment charge and gives us a chance to get a charge of Judgment when we proc Grand Crusader. Now, all this really means is we're going to be able to cast Judgment more often. We do have the perk of being able to reduce the cooldown on Hammer of Justice when we cast Judgment, so that's going to give us the ability to stun a little bit more often, but that doesn't really affect the way that our gameplay is going to go. We are going to be able to reduce the cooldown on Shield of the Righteous much more often because we're going to be able to cast Judgment much more often, and that means that we're going to have that nice armor buff up a lot more than if we didn't have this ability. Outside of that, there's nothing else that's really going on until you decide that you want to switch over to Judgment of Light, and now when you cast Judgment, you're also going to get some healing. So as you can see here, this isn't going to affect us too much. You're going to be able to hit that Judgment button more than you would without this talent build, but overall you're going to be able to practice the core rotation that we talked about in the previous video without any extra distractions, so you can really get a good feel for it. Alright, before we go, we're going to take a look at 2 other types of talent builds here, one for outdoor content and one that's a basic raid setup, assuming that you're not working on any specific boss or content that's going to require specific talents. So this is just kind of the best general purpose talents that you can use for raiding. So starting out first with the outdoor content, we're going to pick up Blessed Hammer for that initial AoE and reduced damage on the next auto attack that you take. This is just a really good ability to have to continually deal damage to all the targets around you. And like I said, the targets can get hit multiple times by the same hammer, so this does end up producing a decent amount of damage for you. You're going to pick up first Avengers so that your Avengers shield will deal increased damage to your main target. You're going to get a fair number of your Grand Crusader procs with this and the increased chance, which means you're going to be able to throw your shield more often and you're going to be able to hit stuff really hard. Blinding Light is a good ability to have in outdoor content because you're going to be able to disorient targets, and you're probably going to be soloing stuff a large majority of the time, so non-holy damage isn't going to be happening, meaning that your targets will stay disoriented for a longer amount of time. You may want to change this up if you're playing with friends that don't have holy damage and they're going to be AoEing things. This is a little less useful, but it does still serve as a big AoE kind of interrupt ability. Next, we're keeping Cavalier for those 2 charges of Divine Steed. This is going to help you to just get from point A to point B a heck of a lot faster. Then we're going to keep Unbreakable Spirit and have the reduced cooldown on Divine Shield, Ardent Defender, and Lay on Hands. more than likely you're going to be using Ardent Defender and or Lay on Hands the most. You could definitely change this one up. I'd say if you're playing with some friends, Hand of the Protector would be pretty good to top people off if you need to. Then we're going to be switching over to Judgment of Light, so you're probably not going to get all 25 attacks off on the same target for Judgment of Light, but this is just some additional passive healing if you need it. If you don't want it, you could definitely switch over to Consecrated Ground for the larger consecration, but if you're comfortable using the smaller size consecration and getting the same kind of work done, then this really doesn't add too much for you in outdoor content, which is why we picked up Judgment of Light. Either one of those is perfectly fine. It's up to you. And then finally, we're going to stick with Righteous Protector to keep the reduced cooldown on Light of the Protector and Avenging Wrath anytime we cast Shield of the Righteous. So we're going to be hitting Shield of the Righteous just to deal some additional damage or to get some defense if we have a lot of enemies on us. And getting that decreased cooldown on our self-heal is going to be great, but also more importantly, we're going to reduce the cooldown on Avenging Wrath, which is going to give us a big offensive button that we can push much more frequently, and that's going to come in handy anytime we have to fight like a rare spawn or an elite mob. Switching over to our basic raid build, we're going to be picking up Holy Shield, so we have that increased block chance to block spells, and a little bit of reflection. We're going to stick with Crusader's Judgment for the extra judgment charges. We're going to go over to Blinding Light because this is going to work as a good AoE interrupt in raids, and because you do have a lot of people stunning a lot of things in raids, your Hammer of Justice is going to have diminishing returns quite often, whereas Blinding Light will not. We're going to stick with Cavalier as our general all-purpose talent on this tier. Also sticking with Unbreakable Spirit to keep those cooldown reductions on our Divine Shield, Ardent Defender, and Lay on Hands, which we will probably use much more often in raids than we would in outdoor content. We're going to keep Judgment of Light. Typically, your enemies in raids are going to take longer to kill, meaning you will probably get use out of all the stacks that you get from this talent, especially if you're fighting a boss. You're going to be able to cast this multiple times and get that healing off as well. And then finally, we're going to stick with Righteous Protector to reduce the cooldown on our Light of the Protector and Avenging Wrath. So this is just a general basic raid build or basic dungeon build if you want to go like full defense that you can use. Obviously, what raid you're in and what bosses you are fighting and your group composition, all sorts of things will factor into which talents you pick. So keep that in mind. These talent builds are not a rule, they are a suggestion, they are something to follow and to practice with, and then make adjustments as you need to. Alright, that's going to do it for our talent overview video. In the next video, we're going to be taking everything that we've learned along with our passive talent build into a dungeon and showing it off in practice. Thanks for watching. I encourage you to do all the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell if you enjoyed this video or this series of guides. Also, if you're interested, you can support the channel on Patreon at patreon.com/Setsuko, where you'll gain access to our Discord channel, behind-the-scenes footage, the opportunity to get involved with the direction of the channel, and more. You can also check out my website, setsuko.com, for even more content about all sorts of geeky, nerdy topics. I hope you're having fun in whatever it is that you're doing, and as always, I'll see you on the next video.